Religion is one of the central themes of Deep Space Nine. Unlike earlier shows and movies in the Star Trek franchise, which envisioned a future of enlightened atheism and treated faith with skepticism and suspicion, DS9 depicts a variety of religious characters who explore faith in their own ways. From Captain Sisko's gradual embrace of his role as the Bajoran emissary to Quark's prayers to the Blessed Exchequer, tonight's episode will explore how DS9 brings religion into Star Trek's humanistic vision of the future.
Welcome to Deep Space Dive, a Star Trek DS9 podcast at Graphic Policy Radio. DS9 is the Star Trek with the greatest focus on political concepts like colonialism, feminism, queerness, and post-scarcity economics. Join hosts and guests who aren't just Trekkies, but activists, academics, artists, therapists, and more as we do a deep dive into the text and subtext where few Star Trek podcasts have gone before.
On Deep Space Dive, we are not doing episode recaps. We are not going episode by episode. There are plenty of other quality podcasts that do that. Instead, each of our episodes discusses a specific theme or character. Also, because of that format, every episode is full of spoilers. So if you are watching the show for the first time and haven't finished, please finish your binge and then go back and listen to our archives. They will be here waiting.
It's true. But who are we? I am Ilana Levin. I'm also the host of Graphic Policy Radio. I've worked at the intersection of comics, nerd culture, and social change for over a decade. And my biggest Star Trek cred is I gave a speech on fan activism at a rally organized by Lita, aka Chase Masterson. And you also probably know me a little bit too well from Twitter as ELANA_Brooklyn.
And I am Sarah Daniel Rasher. When I'm not getting paid to use math to save the world, I write about film and figure skating. I was the founding captain of my high school Star Trek club, and my greatest Star Trek cred is that I once got Nicole DeBoer to kiss me at a convention.
Hey.
I know, right? I'm like, okay, I'm a little bit outranked in that. Well, listeners, you may have noticed or intuited perhaps that Sarah Daniel and I are both Jewish, and we love to bring in guest experts with their own experience and expertise. Who better to opine about the space pope than one of my favorite podcast guests, Anthony Oliveira.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It is a great pleasure to be here again and to be talking Deep Space Nine, which is one of my favorite things ever. Thank you so much for letting me be here.
I was so happy when I heard that you liked the show. I was like, what a great confluence of interests.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love this show. I was and I will say off the top to anyone who's listening and down the line is like, this guy doesn't know anything. I was very nervous because although I've seen it so many times, it's not fresh in my head. So I'm very appreciative that you sent me a refresher so that I would be good to go. But I love this show. I've been obsessed with it since I was a kid. And I'm so happy that it's still in a form I can watch and binge to this day.
Oh, yeah. Well, Sarah put together that record. Anytime anybody gets like a list of what episodes to watch or something from us, it's 100% always put together by Sarah Daniel.
It was a great little reminder platter of like the best of. I hit play on the first one and I saw the credit written by Jane Espenson. I was like, oh, yeah, I love this. Can't wait.
Jane Espenson, who I hugged at a convention, although did not kiss.
Truly one of my favorite writers ever. Ever since I was a kid, I like put like heroes Jane Espenson in my like high school list of things. So,
oh wow,
I love her. I've had the pleasure of talking to her on Slayer Fest. Really smart. I actually used a lot of her academic work on linguistics during my own work. And her ear for dialogue is really incredible in all of her episodes, and even in these Deep Space Nine episodes, which aren't really, you don't really think of Deep Space Nine as being like about witty repartee, but they definitely bring it in that Accession episode.
Oh, well, Accession is such a wonderful piece of writing, and we'll get into that one. I feel like as much as like we say, like we're not going episode by episode, a lot of our discussions do sort of hang on one or two episodes that really get at what we're talking about. And I'm glad that you're like really into talking about Accession, because I just, watched it for the 15th time and have a lot of feelings. Worf gets a funny line in Accession.
He's got a great little scene. He's truly one of the most underrated comedic performers in the Star Trek. Like, Michael Dorn is just a comic genius, working under all those prostheses, and just like he can do so much comedy with just his eyes. It's really amazing.
For our listeners who might not already be aware of his work, I have the short version of the bio, which is that I know him. Him, not Michael Dorn. Him, meaning Anthony.
I stepped on my own intro. Gosh.
No, but it was a good segue, and I hadn't thought about her I hadn't known that you guys had like done academic work on her, so this was interesting as well. He is the award-winning comics writer, including the GLAAD Award for Lords of Empire: Emperor Hulkling, and his Hulkling and Wiccan stories for Marvel's gay issues, like in general, which and the Iceman story, Early Thaw, just got everybody in their feelings about Marvel gay superheroes.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful. And you were on my show not that long ago to talk about the Steven Universe comic you wrote, which included Steven's first Pride Parade.
I was, yeah. It feels like it was a lifetime ago because the pandemic has completely distorted my sense of reality. But yeah.
I know.
Yes.
I remember Pride Parades. Oh my God, we used to go to
Remember
things.
hugging humans?
There are rumors that Chicago is actually going to go through with the Pride Parade this year, which is great because it's down the street from me, but not great because it means I get to have people over. But yeah, like, remember parades and parties?
I don't even know.
Yeah, I am living in a real...
Strangers?
I mean, you want to talk Star Trek, the year of hell, like, many
Yes.
years of hell now.
We are continuing to be in the year of hell. But exciting news also is that your book Dayspring is coming out.
That is true. In early 2023, it is... I have not gone through like whatever kind of media training they may give you, so I always have trouble figuring out how to pitch it to people, but it is kind of like a retelling of the gospel from the point of view of the beloved disciple. It is super horny and super gay and super interested in all the questions we're going to talk about today, which is like, what are the stakes of religion? What does it mean to give oneself over to faith? Do we like a nice pointy hat, which I think is a major question that Star Trek asks again and again. And the answer is always, yes, we do.
The founders really missed out on just giving themselves pointy hats whenever the Forda were around. Like,
yeah,
that
I
would've helped.
truly do feel like they are underdressed as like a species. I feel like they need to give me like a full, like a Stargate helmet kind of moment, you know? I live for a bit more drama.
I also am excited about your graphic novel Apocrypha, which is about queer teens versus the Christian apocalypse, which will be
pattern
out
is emerging.
A pattern of some kind. It's been acquired by HarperTeen. And if you're on Twitter at all, or if you are perhaps exposed to things that get written on Twitter and shared without their creators' consent on other platforms, you may know him as Mia Koopa. And he is also the host of the Devil's Party podcast, as he reads through the classics of Christian literature, including Milton's poetry and the Gospels, through a queer scholarly lens.
Yep.
All my favorite things.
Very germane, actually. I was really struck. As I said, like Star Trek really is in my bones. Like I started watching Lower Decks with my boyfriend the other day, and I was like, had to pause every 30 seconds to be like, let me explain the nature of that joke. But as I said, it's been a minute since I sat with Deep Space Nine, and it's funny rewatching it and thinking like, oh, like one of the interesting things about science fiction in general to me is the way we think about science fiction in the West has kind of emerged out of, to me, Christian literature. Like when we think about, I know that everyone says like Mary Shelley, the first science fiction novel. I don't think Mary Shelley wrote the first science fiction novel, but I do think a woman did write the first science fiction novel, which is Cavendish's The Blazing World, which is literally about going to a new world. And so I'm interested in the way Christianity shapes the form of a lot of these texts, and the way the prophets feel like Milton's God is really fascinating to me. And I'm very excited to dig into this episode.
And of course you're going to hear the like totally expected Jewish pushback from us, and a lot of that is going to come not only just from our own backgrounds, but from our continual pointing out of how many of the writers and producers and actors of the show have Jewish backgrounds.
Oh, I sure hope so. Yeah, I want to hear. Give me all that, please.
Yeah. But at the same time, like, we're coming from a culture where any depiction of religion is going to have at least partially a Christian underpinning because Christianity is so suffused in our culture. And I will try to not make this like a Shakespearean versus Miltonist thing, but some of my best friends are Miltonists. I hold your people no ill will, but I did have to sit through a lot of like 15th century religious poetry during my graduate school career. I had to, the amount of Spencer I had to teach in the name of,
Yeah, not a great man. Pretty good poet, not a good dude. No, I have two of my dissertation chapters were about Shakespeare. You will get no pushback from me for Shakespeareanizing. I mean, one of the great current Shakespeare scholars, Armin Shimmerman, is Quark himself. So, who could be mad about bringing Shakespeare to the table for Deep Space Nine?
I hadn't known that about him.
He's teaching. He currently teaches Shakespeare. I don't remember which school he's at, but he is a prominent Shakespeare scholar. He finished Deep Space Nine and was like, "Well, I guess I will teach the Bard."
I love this. I'm so excited. So how did you first come into DS9 in particular as a Trek fan?
I came into Star Trek in general because I would rush home after school. I went to an all-boys Catholic school in the city, and I would have to take a train back home. And right when I arrived home at like 4 p.m., they would be showing Next Generation. And so every day after school, I was watching the show in syndication. And then when it was replaced by Touched by an Angel, I just started watching all of that. So if you ever do a Touched by an Angel podcast, let me know.
I don't even know.
But I guess I don't really remember when I started watching Deep Space Nine. I think that as a young kid, I think its aesthetic was so different from the other show that it took me a minute to get into it. I didn't watch it in a serialized form at first. So I really didn't come to it and really come to appreciate it until like a real thorough rewatch following a Next Gen rewatch some years later, really after I had already absorbed like the Ronald D. Moore Battlestar Galactica material. So I was watching it kind of as the sort of text of a lot of post Iraq War material, like seeing it as kind of the blueprint for shows like that. So it was a later development. I'm embarrassed maybe to say that I loved Voyager more as a kid because I loved Borg stuff.
Oh, okay.
I do think with a more mature eye, I would have to admit of the three, it is certainly the greater work, I think. I don't know.
Well, that's a correct conclusion.
Yeah,
but
right.
I have been enjoying my Voyager watch of recently, so I hear that.
How
Voyager
far
is better than most of us remember. Like,
especially the final seasons.
Yeah.
I think its reputation is somewhat worse than it deserves. I do think, I do actually kind of think it's interesting to be like, to triangulate between Voyager and Deep Space Nine and sort of the third pylon of like Babylon 5 as like the way we got to Battlestar Galactica and then kind of Mass Effect and like the new kind of way we think of sci-fi now, these kind of UN station-y kind of shows that are interested in critiquing kind of neoliberal projects. I love a Borg moment. I'm very excited about Picard this season doing more Borg Queen stuff. The Borg Queen is my favorite thing in like all of fiction.
I have not seen the new season yet, but I will, and I did love last season. So I should cover Picard on the podcast at some point in general, and it's a good reminder to do so. Sarah, do you want to kick off some of the questions here that you lovingly wrote
sure.
so
I
well?
Also note that I have not seen season 2 of Picard yet either because my wife and I are in like being behind on all of the shows we need to watch, and we just found out there's there's a new show on HBO Max that is literally about gay pirates. So we're like,
Yes.
we are never going to catch up. We are just, eternally doomed. But so let's start off talking about, like, when we think about religion on Deep Space Nine, we usually think of Bajor and Bajoran religion and the prophets and also especially Kira, but also like the Kai and Vedic system. So, and I've always thought of Bajoran religion as purposely trying to not be Christianity and kind of failing. So I'm curious to see where you, Anthony, perceive the Christian and Milton influence in Bajoran religion in particular.
Well, well, in turn, then I want to hear about how Jewish it seems to you folks, because that to me also is interesting. Because, like, one of the things that interests me about Deep Space Nine in general, and particularly the Bajoran religion and its sort of relationship to the very real existence of the prophets, the wormhole aliens, is the way the kind of mechanism of Deep Space Nine as a storytelling landscape is, to me, interested in and designed to critique a lot of the politics of the Roddenberry world that we had seen before that. The kind of way, I mean, I think it's not a surprise to anybody who's followed anything about Gene Roddenberry. Like, Star Trek in its original form and in Next Generation was very much about surpassing religion, right? Like, religion is the kind of superstitious nonsense we must grow past, right?
The opioid of the masses, etc.
Exactly. And that was very much Roddenberry's opinion too, right? Like, there's obviously, especially the original series, couldn't really be like Christianity is for suckers, but it definitely was like, it got as close to that line as it could. And I do think a lot of Deep Space Nine's furniture is designed to critique the limits of that, and actually to speak specifically to the colonial aspects of that, the way, in a kind of Charles Taylorish way, that secularism, as we conceive of it, is very often an attempt for a kind of post-Protestant Christianity to pretend it is unmarked, to pretend that its values are somehow neutral and not just like it becomes more obvious in Taylor's case, like in the way it manifests in Quebec, for example, where it's like, well, we're a secular state, you can't wear your hijab, your crucifix is fine, right? And what I like about Deep Space Nine is the way it is designed to suggest the Federation is really a crock of shit, right? Like, that it's games of pretending that religion is surpassed are actually huge lies, and its interest in saying that religion and culture are actually more inseparable than they seem. I always think about Ensign Ro being yelled at by Riker for wearing her earring, that she's out of uniform, right? In what ways are the Federation uniform is itself shaped by cultural forces, right?
Yeah.
And what's cool about the Bajorans are they are on the cusp of joining this federation and are thinking about the extent to which their religion and their culture are blockages to joining the Federation, are blockages to the kind of assimilation project that the Federation represents. And what I love about Deep Space Nine is from its first moment, it's thinking about that. Because the first thing we see is Sisko's family destroyed by the Borg, right? Locutus ruins his life. The hero of Next Generation becomes this kind of arch-colonialist assimilating villain at the beginning of Deep Space Nine. And that's how Kira thinks about the Federation, right? Like, we finally won our freedom, and here you are. That great speech she gives to Bashir, where he's like, I wanted a job on the wilderness. She's like, that wilderness is my home, right? Like, I love that. And I love the way this series is thinking very seriously about that.
Yeah. One of the big, like, running jokes in sort of online Star Trek fandom that has existed for as long as I've been in it, which is basically as long as the internet, is like Deep Space compared to what? And that, you're right, that's very tied to sort of that like colonial faux secularism. And the other thing you were making me think of is literally every episode I rewatched for this podcast episode that was very religion focused also had at least one conversation where they were talking about how it was going to affect Bajor joining the Federation.
I think, and again, like the question, and we talk about this a lot on my podcast because we're reading the Gospel of John right now. And John is a very, for your listeners who don't know, the writer of the Gospel of John, whoever they were, we know that they were very Jewish. Like, they know a lot about Jewish practice. They know really a great deal of minutia about the layout of Jerusalem, for example, about what Jesus would have to do at Sukkot and all that sort of stuff, where the pool of Siloam is, where Bethesda is. In fact, we still to this day find things that confirm things in the Gospel of John about ancient Jerusalem. And yet, it is very often the source for a lot of the anti-Semitic material that Christianity has hurled at Jewish culture since, because John is engaged in a sectarian fight with his current, like, the synagogues of his own day and the figures he keeps insisting and demonizing as the Pharisees. And what's interesting is I always call it the Velcro of that, because you can feel the author trying to pry apart culture from religion. Is there a way to think about your upbringing, your practices, your rituals as separable from your religious beliefs? And what's cool about Bajor as it's conceived is how impossible to do that it is, right? In positive figures like Kira and in negative figures like Kai Wynn, who is this sort of completely venal political figure using always the language of religion to get what she wants.
Or even like, I mentioned that we see very few secular Bajorans, but the one that is most readily brought up is really Odo, who was raised in Bajoran culture, and looking at how he does secularism in a way that's very defiant, that's dismissive in a way that like you see from like people who have left religious communities and have a chip on their shoulder,
right?
And like the contrast between that and how Sisko does Bajoran religion in a very Federation way, where he's like, I'm going to do research and I'm going to like put this obelisk on the holodeck so that I can like find the ancient culture, and I'm going to build flying ships to honor Bajoran history. And it's like, he's definitely got that sense of like wonder and gradual, very genuine buy-in to the faith. But he's doing it in a way that's coming directly out of his own culture and is very alien in a way that's kind of delightful.
Yeah.
That's a great way of explaining it, too. When I first coming into watching this show, one of the things that I was really impressed by was how clearly it understood religious leadership to be a political decision. And like how refreshing it was. In so many shows, the decision of who should the next Kai be would have been completely based on like, well, my God says this.
Right.
And this was like, no, we know that this is politicking. And, like to have a show that acknowledged that these religious decisions were political felt very smart to me.
Yeah.
And the power struggles within the church / I guess whatever it's not called within the faith of Bajor.
Oh, how interesting! I've never really thought about that. They don't really use the word church, do they? Ever?
No.
Really? Yeah.
I don't know what they
talk about, like
so
the
wild.
Vedics Council and things like that, but they don't. They don't talk about it as like a monolith. It's almost like Bajoran religion is so deeply ingrained that it just is.
Right.
Yeah, because there's one religion for the entire planet, which, like as humans, we're like, that doesn't happen. Like that. So that must be right. Like if you're on a planet and there's only one religion, then you don't have a need for the name of church. It's right. So this
right.
is,
yeah, they're just services, right? They're just kind of, yeah, that's true.
And that's the way in which they're the least Jewish, is because you can't have two like three, what is it, like two people arguing over which of the remaining two shuls is the appropriate one to attend. So yeah, that's kind of,
does it
that was
strike
interesting.
you in any other major ways as particularly Jewish, as of thinking?
The Bajoran religion does not feel very Jewish.
Not at all.
It draws a lot from sort of outsider perceptions of Hinduism. And I'm saying that really carefully because I know that on the off chance that that a certain friend of mine listens to this, that like she would be very quick to point out that like there's a big difference between Hinduism as practiced and Hinduism as colonizing white people think it's practiced. But like the stuff with the castes and a lot of the sort of character and window dressing of a lot of the celebrations seem to have a lot of South Asian influence. But a lot of the things that like Alana and I think of as being sort of quintessentially Jewish, and we talked about this in an early episode about Worf too, that we see a lot more Jewishness in like Klingon culture, and of course in complicated and problematic and sometimes really satisfying ways with Ferengi culture, but Bajoran religion doesn't really seem to draw on Judaism as much, at least only by like contrast.
To me, the thing that I identified with, and this is sort of jumping ahead to another point, but like to me, like as a viewer, what I identified with the show's portrayal of Bajoran religion was the fact that it felt like the first time I'd seen a science fiction show that had a religion that was egalitarian in terms of gender, and that there were people who believed in it who also believed in science, and that there were people who had positions of power who were women. And all of that is coherent with like the progressive Jewish synagogue communities in which I was raised and that were completely normal to me and that are incredibly common in America. And so much science fiction felt like it was sort of driven by this atheism that's hostile to, just because you're some hypothetical author had an oppressive experience of Christianity doesn't mean that everybody has an oppressive experience of religion. Just because your religion is backwards and right wing, some of us had lesbian chazans, you know what I mean? So for me to then see like a show in which there were characters who were like progressive minded and women who were religious leaders and stuff like that, I was like, yeah, that's normal to me. But that also was something that I imagine a Unitarian or like from someone from a progressive Episcopal, like, like there's Christian churches that are like that too, but it was so nice for me to see that and to not have religion pitted as the opposite of science all the time.
From my outside perspective, one of the things that does seem Jewish about Bajoran religion as opposed to particularly Catholic, and in many ways this also makes it kind of oddly Protestant, even though its structure is quite Catholicized, is the insistence on the text, like as source of meaning. That is a very un-Catholic impulse. Whereas they're constantly on this show looking for texts and reading the prophets and thinking about what it means that this text says that. And like Cisco is like trying to decode markings. That is a very like, a cardinal will tell you, they'll explain it to you. A bishop will rely on the magisterium. I'm interested in the comparison of drawing Bajor next to Hinduism, because then you get to think about the way that the Cardassian occupation is like the British Raj.
Yes, which is a lot of our take on. One of the things that Sarah and I assert in some of our Cardassian focus coverage is that we think that the particular form of fascism that is displayed by the Cardassians is much more similar to British and American.
Yeah, and also
specifically
on the flip side, like Ducat's sort of fetishization of their culture, right? As a thing he can pillage and as a thing he can dress up as in a lot of ways. And a thing that he can decide he is the messiah of.
Yeah. Exactly. So it really does dovetail like that for us. But I think that's a really interesting point in terms of the focus on interpreting the text. That just sort of like, I don't know, for me, that's sort of like, but that's what religion does, right? I guess. Well, not everything, I guess. That's interesting.
It's interesting to draw that distinction from Catholicism but I feel like so much of how texts are used by the Bajorans is to like predict and to like figure out what's going to happen or what's supposed to be happening or what the prophets want, where I feel like Jewish use of text is very presentist. It's very like, what are the rules? How are we supposed to do this? Are giraffes kosher?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you use a dragon as a Shabbos goy? Kind of like, it's there's a sort of sense, and I think even in much more orthodox strands of Judaism, to say like none of this is the purpose. None of this is the purpose's revelation or prediction. It's all to tell you how to live your life now. So there are times when the approach to Bajoran texts is that, but they're very focused on prophecy and very focused on the future in a way that's different, I think, from most experiences of...
No, it's true. Like, anytime you hear somebody trying to predict something based on the Torah, you know that person's not Jewish. That's some goyish stuff. Always.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, nobody's playing with that. No numerology. That's just not, no.
Right. I particularly liked in the sample episodes, we all watched the Accession one. For those of you who don't remember, is an episode where the wormhole like vomits back at this moment where Cisco is like, gosh, like it might be nice not to be the emissary. The wormhole like spits out a dude who got swallowed by it 200 years ago and is a better fit to be the emissary, is a Bajoran poet, importantly a poet who has now returned, and starts to lead Bajor into kind of a reformist, conservative direction. He wants to reinstitute the caste system, the Dajaras that used to separate before the occupation, the societies. And I really liked that the text positions his status as sort of the celebrated poet as the reason he would be so accepted. I like that idea a lot. I've been thinking about Eric Auerbach, who said, obviously a Jewish scholar during World War II, writing in Turkey, sort of thinking about what do we do now that the West is over? Thinking about how he has a great statement. I wish I could remember the exact wording, where he talks about how the God of Judaism is almost a product of its literary tradition. Like, it is a concept Judaism invents as a response to its own relationship to language as speech act, as creationary event. And I really like the way the prophets kind of reflect that as sort of this, even in calling your gods the prophets, like the thing that speaks is the God. I really like that.
I mean, one of the questions that I have is like, it's so interesting that when you have somebody coming from the past, like what is the first thing that they want to change is like to reinstate the old oppressive social order.
Right.
Like so you're sort of like, well, of course that's how someone would be, but like, is it necessarily, is everyone from the past is their first urge to try to reinstate an oppressive social order? I don't know.
And a lot of it, like his first like expression of disgust is in discovering that Kira, who we learn is actually of one of the higher castes, has lowered herself to become a soldier out of necessity. And like, that's where he starts to perceive that the new social order is wrong, not from people of low caste trying to raise themselves up, but of someone like Kira, abandoning like a higher calling. And
her
in
calling
this
to
culture,
make those statues.
the artist caste is like way up there,
which is also nice to
That's
hear.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's right. Yeah. That is when he has that reaction.
Yeah, it's always, I mean, I always, as a kid, was like, wouldn't it be cool to, like, show Shakespeare our present day? And it's like, the last thing you'd want is to find out he's kind of a dick, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that represents, like, just general an assumption that anybody from the past is going to be retrograde, or, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too much about what was an offhanded decision to create conflict in the story, but...
Yeah, it's a weird, I don't know. I want to think about that. I'm trying to think. I'm racking my brain to think of like, do we meet any people from the past in Star Trek who are like rad folks that we want to hang out with?
I don't know.
Is it always an atavistic instinct?
Well, we do meet people from less developed cultures. Like, I'm thinking of the episode First Contact, which is not the movie First Contact, where there's the one woman who's like, oh, yay, luxury space communism, I want it. And then the rest of her planet is like, nope, we are going to be isolationist. Or like Saru on Discovery, who leaves his planet behind completely because he's the only one who's ready for the future in a lot of ways. So we don't necessarily get a lot of like time travel for that, but we get a lot of like sort of cross-cultural travel.
Yeah, it's true. They've never done... It would be kind of neat to have a human who was time displaced as a crew member. That would be fun. Yeah, even Ensign Ro in her initial appearances, right? Like, that is kind of the point of her character on Next Generation, right? It's thinking about the same things that Bajor as a concept is meant to think about. Actually, it's kind of in parallel to Worf's sash that he wears. Her earring is meant to signify in the same way. Actually, it's funny. I was just watching the first episode of Lower Decks, and there's just a flash of a background shot where you see a human character in a Starfleet uniform wearing a turban, and I was like, "Oh, there are Sikh members of Starfleet. Like, that's actually interesting to know, and that's interesting that the show has now progressed to a point where it's like, yeah, that character would be allowed to wear his turban, right? Like, that seems." I don't know if Roddenberry would have let that happen, right?
Nope. Not because he's a bigot. You know, like we need to be honest about that, right? So yeah, that is a sign of progress away from an anti-religious position. Yeah. One of the things that struck me as we were doing the watch for preparing for this episode was how much of the conversations that the characters are having in those episodes are about faith and having faith. And that's just like, I never even think about that, but it's such a big thing for the vast majority of people who have any kind of religion. I was like, oh yeah, no, that's a thing. I was thinking about, you see so much of Kara's very personal faith. And I love In the Hands of the Prophet, she says, I envied Kai Wynn because she's a true believer. I wanted my faith to be as strong as hers. But then she also questions whether Kai Wynn is really a person of faith or if she's just political machinations. Mm-hmm. And like, is she believing what she's saying? And and somebody could argue that doesn't matter, but I think it's interesting. And certainly, she tries to explain faith to Odo, and she basically, was it Thomas Aquinas, basically paraphrases him, like, yeah, where was that?
Is this an accession? That's the thing about faith. If you have it, you can't understand it. And if you do, no explanation is necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, what a quote. And Frank's like, I think that's Thomas Aquinas. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. And
but Kira doesn't credit him.
Larger, wonderful question of like, what kind of faith is really strongest? The faith that is just sort of unquestioning and unwavering, or faith like Kira's where she's constantly questioning and reaffirming for herself. As much as she said no explanation is necessary, she is constantly explaining her own faith to herself.
And sort of holding intention, right? Like, that's what the nature of Odo's question is, right? Like, I thought you believed Sisko was the emissary. Now you're saying this guy's the emissary. How can they both be right? And actually, it's funny because that same question came back in Covenant, the episode where Gul Dukat is now leading that Pa Wraith cult. And she says very specifically to her old Vedic, who's like, you believe what... He's like trying to be, a good neoliberal about it. Like, you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. Can't we just both have our beliefs? And Kira's response is, well, we can't both be right. And that is kind of the big question of secularism, right? Is like, we all have these absolute truths that we're holding as absolute truths. Can they be held in tension? And I really like the way the show... Actually, it's really fun rewatching it now and seeing the way Dukat really is made to be the flip side of Cisco in like really thoroughgoing ways. Like I kept thinking about actually the way he's almost St. Paul, right? Like he is the person who was persecuting you, who's now like, actually, I'm the head of your faith now. Isn't that cool? Mm-hmm. It's like, is it cool? I don't know how I feel about that, actually. A great character and a great way to bring that conversation to the table of like, well, look at the dangers of faith that is quite a lot like Kira's. I like that her old Vedic is actually a person of integrity who truly believes the Pa-wraiths are a more active god that they could actually get something out of, whereas the prophets have been so standoffish all this time.
Yeah, and we do see a lot of faith with integrity, and I like that while there's certainly Kaiwins who are really in it for themselves, although there's also moments where she expresses, like, in her way, her faith is very strong, and like her faith itself isn't political. She just uses all kinds of political means to advance herself because her faith is tied in with power.
I find her so amazing. I think she really is one of the best characters on the show, precisely because of what you just mentioned, this sort of like, in a world where everyone around her is actually talking to gods, she is having the real spiritual experience of being like, I guess I'm doing my best. I guess this is right. I sure wish they would talk to me, but clearly they're not. I'm just going to do my best with it. And even though she's entirely self-serving, even though she is entirely Machiavellian, she is, I think, a true believer until the moment where she just has her crisis at the end and is just like, I shed a lifetime of hypocrisy, she says. And I think it's sad that she comes to that final conclusion that she has lived a life in service of something she didn't really feel in her heart, but genuinely tried to live out. I find that is actually a really interesting faith journey to depict on screen.
And the more that we're talking about this, the more I'm thinking about faith journeys that aren't depicted as faith journeys, and how, like, Odo, as much as he's like this cynical secularist, has absolute faith in his sort of ethical structure. Mm-hmm. And, like, Bashir's, like, unwavering faith in science will fix it. Like, I'm thinking of Rapture, which is one of the other ones I just rewatched, which is the one where Cisco starts having visions.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And there's a point where Bashir looks at him and he's like, either you have the surgery and you live, or you don't have the surgery and you die. And just the way the whole episode is constructed, my feeling kept being like, are you real sure of that, Julian? And another one that I put on the list, which is Vic, where if something goes wrong in his life, you can literally call his creator.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also, the flip side of the Odo thing you just mentioned is, like, he is this sort of thoroughgoing atheist, and he is also the god of a different culture, right? Like, he does eventually have to deal with the fact that the founders are, for many cultures in the Gamma Quadrant, gods. And that is a great temptation for him. Oh, so go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'm throwing out a question from one of our listeners that I think fits in really perfectly here. Matt asked, Weiyun 5's gods are all around him, guiding his endeavors. Kai Wynn's gods never answer her prayers. I mean, you could say they did because they freed from Cardassia, but, like, I get what he's saying. They don't talk to her directly. They never answer her questions, yet she believes the gods are still there. What other things are different and what are similar between these two quote-unquote servants who play with words? And I really think it's interesting to look at Weiyun 5 and Kai Wynn and compare everything to each other. Because, like,
Yeah, I think, well, one way they're different is that Weiyun 5 is having a hell of a time, right? Like, he is having a ball. Like, the job satisfaction is high for him. The gods walk amongst them, and he is their good and faithful servant. He really is kind of the embodiment of that philosophy, right? Like, he is very happy to serve. He is happy to be a minor functionary in a greater design. And his death does not seem to really particularly bother him because there'll just be another one around the corner, right?
Well, he does get really sad when when he finds out they get rid of the entire factory that would have produced other Wayun 5s.
That is very sad. That makes me really sad. Poor guy.
That is
really
kind
charmed
of
by him. I don't know if it's just because it's Jeffrey Combs or what. That speech he has about like the uplifting of their species, where they were just like these berry-eating creatures, and the founders made like this miraculous new life for them. I find that very touching as a speech.
But yeah, like Star Trek is amazing in this show because you have actual gods or people, various aliens who other aliens consider to be gods, walk amongst them. And then, you know, you have the tension between like, are these the wormhole aliens? Like, what are we calling these things that other people consider to be gods? And you have some people who are able to talk to and hear from them, and others who might be believers who don't actually get to hear from them.
Yeah, I was, again, I mentioned this right off the top, what's Miltonic and interesting to me about the prophets is the way that the particular problem they represent is a being that does not experience time linearly, that you have to explain past, present, and future to them, and it's not really clear they ever quite get it. And that, to me, there's like a straight line between the wormhole and Milton's God, who like whenever he speaks has to shift verb tenses mid-sentence 3 or 4 times. Like he watches Satan fall and is like, he will pervert and shall pervert. Like he recognizes, I'm just generally interested in characters for whom cause and effect are not necessarily in relationship to each other. And I kind of like, in that respect, the prophets are gods in a very classical sense, right? They can put their scale on linear history wherever they want to and perceive what its effect will be. What I like about them is their insistence that they are of Bajor, right? That over and over again they say, we are of Bajor, in that their relationship is entirely localized, right? You mentioned the thing about Deep Space Nine, deep space in relationship to what? I like the way at the end of the pilot, suddenly Bajor is the single most important planet in the Alpha Quadrant. And that is because the prophets have decided to sort of descend into history in this very real, perceptible way. And everybody around them has to now deal with the fact that the gods walk among us again, right? Like, that's really cool.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, in that, like, one of the central tenets of a lot of religions is like the believers are chosen in some way as the center of the center of the world, the center of the universe. And what happens when not only does someone witness your God saying, you, Bajor, are the center of the universe, but then like interplanetary politics back up that assertion.
Yeah. It's, I mean, and Bajor, I mean, we're just talking about the sort of Cardassia as Raj. Like, Bajor is a place that has been strip mined, right? Like, their ore has been stolen. The Cardassians have taken everything of value. And now a very real material value has reasserted itself, which is, like, now they are a gate to the Gamma Quadrant, right? Like, they are a trade route all of a sudden, and all these other cultures have to scurry to pretend to care about their religious values for this very, like, material capitalist gain, right? I love the way the series keeps insisting that the Federation is deeply uncomfortable with Sisko being the emissary, but they insist he play along with it because it's useful to bringing Bajor into the Federation, which is, of course, at first just kind of Picard's pet project, and then becomes one of the major focal points of, like, the Federation's military strategy, right?
What do we think of, like, the whole concept of, like, people who are in direct relation with those that they believe to be God? Like, you know, to me, I'm all like, that sounds like some science fiction craziness. I guess there's people who really do believe that that's a thing. I'm like, I don't know, but I guess that's do. But it's so interesting that this is a Star Trek in which you have two groups of people. I mean, I think that the changelings are pretty clear that they're like, we're not actually God. We're just fucking with you for power. But the prophets don't have that same vibe. They don't, I don't know, I guess it sort of does bring me to another listener question, actually, about their role. Frequent graphic policy guest / lapsed Catholic and token Italian American, John Arminio asks, about the wormhole gods. What are their motivations? Why does Sisko go along with their plotting and abandon his family to go chill with them in the finale? Why doesn't the show ever admonish the wormhole aliens for constantly interfering with the development of Bajor for reasons they never make clear? Should we, the viewers, be on their side because Sisko is going along with their plan to be the emissary?
I feel like the show does admonish them. I feel like it admonishes them through Jake, especially, that whenever stuff really goes wacky with the prophets, Jake is right there saying, Dad, really?
Right.
And there's something both very sweet about it, but also like, hey, listen to the kid about it.
Yeah, and it's notable, right, that the Pa Wraiths use Jake as their vessel, right, when they're fighting Kira in that Reckoning episode. Like, he is the critic of the prophets and embodies their kind of cosmic critics in the Pa Wraiths. Yeah, I think that question is really interesting because it's one of the questions about religion is to what extent does the religious... the mystical experience trump the ethical experience, right? This is like, to me, pure Kierkegaard. I talk about this a lot on the podcast. Like Kierkegaard has a lot to say about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, right? God says, kill me a son, and you must do it, even though it is in direct contradiction to every ethical imperative, right? Because it is the command of God. Like, when something that is beyond the ethical makes a demand, you have no choice, good or ill, but do it. And the show is thinking about that. Like, I think this goes to the question of, like, how are we supposed to feel about him abandoning his family? Jake is a kind of Isaac figure, right?
Yeah.
He is the thing that Sisko gives up to serve this god. Go ahead.
He's also a secular prophet figure. He's a writer. He's a writer who, in The Visitor, it's sort of set up that he's like sort of destined almost to write this novel that like it inspires an entire generation. That he's this like truth-telling journalist. So it's interesting to see him fitting into sort of those religious schemas.
Yeah, and it is exactly the question of intervention that sort of obsesses when we do get the quite late reveal of the idea of the Pa Wraiths, which is like shifts their religion in kind of a more Zoroastrian direction. But the reason they fall is because they want, the narrative we're given that is never actually really contradicted is that the Pa Wraiths wanted to play a more direct role in Bajoran history. They wanted to save Bajor, ostensibly, and that's why they're cast out of the wormhole and sort of forced into time, right? Which is really interesting if you think about it from a Christian perspective, where, like, because that's kind of what the sun does, right? Like, there's a lot of kind of Gnostic versions of Christianity where the sun becomes the sort of avatar of wisdom. Even in some like ophitic versions, like the sun becomes the serpent here to lure us away from the bad demiurge, right? Who gives?
Are we talking about the SON or the SUN?
SON, sorry.
Okay. Just you said Zoroastrian, and I'm like, well, okay, keep going.
Yeah, like I'm interested in the way that, like, yeah, I agree with the question that, like, there is a question of, like, well, what business do the prophets have? I mean, in Federation terms, violating the Prime Directive, right? And influencing Bajor in this way. And yet their great enemies are much more active influencers of that culture. To which I don't think the show gives an answer, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about Sisko at the end of this.
Something that didn't hit me until this watching of the one where he has where Sisko has the prophecy from the tablets is that, like, the prophecy, the warning about the vision he has about, like, the locusts coming and going past Bajor and going to Cardassia, like, that's true. Like, that is the Dominion coming and skipping over Bajor because Bajor didn't join the Federation yet at that moment. And, like, I don't think I had quite appreciated that the prophetic vision was, like, literally actually useful, helpful information.
Yeah, I like that the way the show always gives you the science and then is like and it's a spiritual vision, right? Like his like I don't even know the technobabble. His neutrino peptides are out of balance or whatever. And yet he has like it reminded me that episode of like trepanning, you know, like if I cut this hole in my head, I can hear the angels and it's like, I guess. And like that's just a different way of conceiving of these like spiritual technologies, right? Like so much of a lot of earth culture is about like you get high on this and you can talk to the gods, and like how much of like even Christian like evangelical Christianity, like going into these trances and like experiencing glossolalia and all these things, like it has real measurable medical effects on the body, and yet also maybe to believers has this kind of spiritual dimension.
This is actually reminding me of the Trill, which is has a very sort of metaphysical, like we don't know how any of this works, it just sort of does aspect to it, and is very ritualistic and is very like, I feel like the Trill sometimes are sort of the avatars of spiritual, not religious. And it's sort of the flip side where they perceive all of this like, oh, we're just going to take this past life out of your body and put it in your body and it's all going to be fine and it all works. And it's all science. Trust us. It's really science. And is like the least explained thing on the entire show, but is presented in this very like, they don't perceive what they're doing as religion per se. But when you look at it from far enough outside, it's like, how does any of this work?
Right.
Like, do we just not talk about the fact that there is an underlying structure to it? Or do we really just not know how this works, but accept it as part of the workings of the universe?
Yeah, this takes us into, there's ways that Star Trek defines itself against a lot of like Doctor Who, for example, right? Where it's like he's just a wizard and like we'll make up some science babble, but he can just kind of do whatever we want him to do. Star Trek is always like there is an explanation. How much we can perceive it is not really clear. And like the edges of this are characters like Q, right? Where it's like, well, he's just kind of a Mr. Mitzias Pitalik, but there's a science presumably to the collective, right? Like we don't know what it is, but if we did, we would have to be a Q to understand it. And these are just technologies for understanding the world. And I like the way Deep Space Nine against Next Generation kind of lets these things sit in tension. Whereas like there's that episode of Next Generation where that there's like that like charlatan god, right? Who's like pretending to be like the Klingon devil and all those things to like shake down this culture and like get real material payment out of them. And Picard goes out of his way to like unmask her. Whereas Deep Space Nine is more interested in letting you can call them the wormhole aliens or you can call them the prophets. They're not going to take offense either way because they don't care, right?
This sort of brings me to a question that I had put on our list because I love that you brought up Q, which is on both the Next Generation and Voyager. There's a lot of Q, and Q works as this just sort of like embodiment of any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And like that is a totally acceptable premise in both Next Generation and Voyager, but for some reason Q makes no sense on Deep Space Nine, and I was wondering if you had some insight into exactly why Q is such a poor fit for this particular show.
I have a few thoughts. One of them, I think, is that Q and Sisko are both critiques of Picard. And so they're actually much closer in character to each other than they are to Picard. Like, I know that Sisko punches Q in the face. I actually think they could kind of get along. They both kind of have a kind of mercurial... Like, I love Sisko's sense of humor because I don't always understand it. Like, he's often smirking at something that he finds funny that I'm not sure quite what it is that is amusing him, that I think would actually play to Q as a character. But it goes to the thing I was just saying, which is like, I think Sisko is much more interested as a searcher into spirituality than Picard is. Picard has to understand it. Picard has to be master and commander of his own ship. And I think Sisko can he knows how to ride the wave in a way that I think Q would understand. Also, the flip side is that, I mean, Q is such an obvious representation of Picard's repressed homosexuality. Sisko doesn't have that, so it doesn't really fly. Like, there's no frisson of that. So Q's like, oh, this is no fun. I'm gonna go like pinch Picard's butt again, like, and off he goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, my impression of Sisko's response to Q is really just like, I eat bigger problems than you for breakfast.
Exactly.
Like, you're just, you're just annoying. Like,
yeah,
I can literally ignore you and you'll go away.
He has much more dignified gods to deal with than Q.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean, that would be a fun scene, actually, is the prophets versus Q. I don't think Q would get the better of that scene, but because they just vibe. Q can't relax. He shares that with Picard and with Janeway too, right? Like that's Janeway's whole thing, is like she has arrived in the Delta Quadrant, which is because of the sort of ubiquitous Borg presence is sort of technologically depressed, and therefore the Voyager is like this god ship that the Kazon and the Vidians are constantly trying to get their hands on. And Janeway moves through the Delta Quadrant as a kind of goddess, right? Like, she is always the most powerful ship in every encounter. She always has to keep this replicator technology out of people's hands. And that's how she's like Q, right? And that's where their relationship sort of spins out of. And again, like, there's a sexual tension there that Sisko just does not have with John Delancey.
That's a great insight about Voyager. Thank you.
Yeah, Sisko,
yeah, it's
the
kind
least
of
clear
like
character too.
I do think so.
I was like, somehow, who is heterosexual on Star Trek?
Or on Deep Space Nine, at least. Sisko.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not usually a proponent of like straight characters, but Sisko is a very straight character, right? Like that he's such a dad. Like I can't think of a single. His closest male friend is like Curzon, right? Like there's something about that I find actually in its own way quite charming.
Oh, totally. Yeah. He's like the heterosexual. It's wild. Mm-hmm. One thing, it would be a shame to not kind of get your thoughts talking about the religious structure of the Vedic assembly and the pull and push between faith and literal corruption that we see, and the politicking in the selection of religious leadership and stuff like that we get to see play out in the series.
I'm obsessed. As I said, like, Kai Wynn is really one of my favorites. I love all the like Vedic Burial stuff and like her really vicious attempt to destroy his career so that she can ascend to the Kai ship. I think what it does, what feels very Catholic about it to me, is I feel really focalized through Kira in this, where it's like you have this very sincere expression of faith through which is lensed this kind of hierarchy, and yet you are constantly aware of the like deep, profound insufficiency and corruption of that hierarchy. That to me feels very Catholic, and Kai Wynn is a very familiar figure to me. That's sort of, I love the way every one of her lines has two meanings, the sickly sweet one and the dagger that's in it. That was every nun and priest I grew up with. So that to me feels very familiar.
I feel like the religious leaders, the Bajoran religious leaders do all sort of come out of like Christian religious figure central casting. Like, as much as I am one of the foremost Burial apologists, I fully admit that he is basically a youth pastor.
Yes, real youth pastor energy. Oh my god, yeah, exactly.
But he's like totally mainline Protestant.
Yeah, he reads as Wynn is very like Orthodox Catholic, and he's the one who's here to like, let's be friends. Like, he actually kind of has he has the kind of vibe that Pope Francis seemed like he was going to have when he came in. Like, Wynn is very Ratzinger. Like, she's very Benedict,
Yes.
right? Like, this sort of like,
Yeah.
let's go back to the Latin Mass. Let's all turn around and say these old chants from before when things were better and there weren't all these gays everywhere. And with her comes the sort of like, don't worry, I will hide all your corruption. And Bareil actually has... The way he most reminds me of Francis is the way he's in over his head, right? Like, he just sort of, he does not have the allies he needs in the cardinals. He cannot get the reforms he seems to want to pass, right? Like, that feels shockingly a lot like the Bajoran situation. I actually really admire the show's thoughtfulness in thinking about how beautiful a lot of the Bajoran rituals are on the show. I was really struck when we were watching Covenant for this episode that when we go to the Pa Wraith cult, I really love the touch. I don't think it's ever, I don't know, you'll tell me if this is true. Is it ever stated outright, or is it just a really cool decision they make that the Pa Wraith cults wear their earring on the other ear? Because I found that that's so amazing.
And
like
they're red, and like they're red crystals and stuff.
Like the idea of being like, I'm not listening at this ear anymore. I'm listening at the left ear. It's just like such a evocative, elegant costuming decision that I find really amazing.
Ooh, can we talk about the symbolism of the various Bajoran religious clothing? Like, not just the cool hats, but like also the earrings. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Oh, yeah. I love the earring. Like the idea that this is how I signal my attentiveness to the words of the prophets, right? The idea of like, I wear on my body the sign that signals my willingness to hear. That's really beautiful to me. And the way the show, like the thing I didn't notice until this episode is that Kira's cast is visible from her earring, right? Like, there's that scene where the cafe is full and she's holding her Radagino and she's like, I guess it's full. And the woman stands up and says, take my seat. Your Dejara is whatever and mine is this. And she gestures at her ear, meaning that simply by looking at Kira is legible always. Apparently has always been legible. We just didn't know here until like season 4 that you can read her place in society on her ear. That to me is really a shockingly beautiful decision to make.
I think that we're going to need to do like the Deep Space Nine has an ear fetish podcast.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, it's not only that, but it's like the way that you read somebody's soul and their fate. You read their paw by grabbing their ear.
Which just seems so invasive to me. I can't even imagine a stranger touching my ear.
Which is also how you jerk off a Ferengi, which is why it's so weird.
It's also all my cats want from life, so they have that in common. My cats are like, please, stranger, please touch my ear. Thank you. Not my stomach, just my ear. Okay. So that means they're all cats. I understand that now. Yeah, that is pretty wild. Of course, also you've never heard anybody say to somebody, "Oh, your paw isn't strong," right? Has there ever been a moment where
weak paw?
It's very charming. Weak paw. I don't know. Moving right along.
It's like feeling fruit at the grocery store. I really miss Wynn's great pointy hat she had when she was a Vedic. That like. She kind of looks like the Sydney Opera House. Like it's a bunch of forward. I love that one. I like less her like Doge hat that she wears as the Kai. Like, although it is more like popey to kind of look simpler when you're the person in charge, right? Like cardinals get their big fancy red dresses and the Pope is just like in a much simpler look with the little skull cap, right? I do like that, but I do miss the drama of her Vedic Wynn moment.
I do love all of the like just sort of like one shot Vedics and how almost all of them are like guys in skull caps and beards, and you just assume that you should go up to them and ask for your next quest.
Right, yes. Or there's the step below, the Ranjans, the sort of just monk level, where it's just some dude who's just like I love that irascible one who's like leading him through the Bahala ruins, where he's just like clear, like, that's the real vibe. Actually, there was one line I really hated in one of the episodes we watched. Otherwise, a great episode, but Quark says, never trust ale from a religious society. It's like, monks make the best beer. What are you thinking? Like, that old man knows how to make a killer beer.
Yeah. I guess that was just lost in their, like, or maybe that's strictly true for humans, you know? Maybe we're the out. Maybe that's not, I don't know.
Maybe so. Yeah. I do wish we had a little bit more human religion. I do. I find it is a very speaking silence in Deep Space Nine that we really get no expression of it whatsoever, right? Like, the Ciscos are from New Orleans. Like, it would be nice to have some of that brought up, you know? Like, how does Cisco feel about it in relationship? What did he grow up in? Like, what does his faith look like? Is he just sort of this generic Federation secular atheist, or is there more there? Like, does anybody have anything to say about this? I wish Deep Space Nine did more of that, but I get that we're trying to crack a shell that is, like, at this point already 30 years old.
There's a lot of fan conversation too about representing Bashir's Muslim heritage. But it's all, I feel like that was kind of a compromise that was made with the sort of Roddenberry faction, is like, okay, we'll engage with religion in a way that we haven't in the past and acknowledge it as a form of diversity and not be bigots about it. But at the same time, there's like this sort of mandate to preserve the Federation and by extension human culture as no longer religious.
Yeah, it does feel like, I feel like maybe we've shifted since then. Like, the Discovery did the whole Red Angel storyline. As I mentioned, there are visible Sikh members of Starfleet on lower decks, but it's not like I really need the, like, Jesus episode of Star Trek, you know, like, that sounds like a real nightmare, actually. but
no, I mean, I think that's the question. Yeah, like, when you have, like, religions that are racialized, then it becomes a different, like, you can't just say, well, you don't have any religion, because then you're like, well, thanks for doing the work of Hitler, assholes.
Yeah, right.
You know,
exactly.
like, which is not the actual point. But by the same token, oh my God, if there was a fucking Christmas episode of Trek, I would be not amused. Right?
Right.
It's hard.
And at the same time, Christmas is the kind of tradition that you could imagine surviving a wholesale cultural secularization.
Yeah, that's the truth. Given
Exactly,
all the people
because
who
again,
celebrate
Christianity
it,
thinks of itself as unmarked, right? Like, the Christianity thinks that its practices are somehow a default, and it's like, have you interrogated how that might be so? You know, like,
is it because you killed everyone?
Yeah, exactly.
No, it's very complicated. But it is still such a special show that we get to even have all these conversations about religion in space. We haven't talked about the Ferengi religion at all.
Yeah,
the most American of the religions.
Prescient in some ways, I think. The Great Exchequer, like, you could imagine some prosperity gospel folks publishing a book called that, like, next year. Like, it feels like the kind of thing that would be very of the moment. It's funny thinking about, for those of you who don't know, like, Quark prays to, what does he pray to it? How would you describe it exactly?
He prays to the Blessed Exchequer, and he prays by paying it.
Right. That's, yeah. I think we have seen those churches operating currently in the American South, right? Like, that's happening now. It's funny in general the way the show really does, because we're talking about how it's sort of opening the conversation to religion, and it was doing it at this moment when the culture was trying to shut it down, right? Like, I think a lot about the way we've come out of this sort of Hitchkins new atheism that was emerging again, like, around the Iraq war, right? Like, as a kind of way to justify that war, right? Like, we are the unmarked good secular culture that therefore should make war against this sort of oppressive backwards culture, right? And Deep Space Nine was ahead of us on interrogating the problems with that position, even before that position had finished articulating itself, really.
That's a great point.
Anthony, was there anything else you wanted to bring up and talk about with us?
I'm just so thankful that you are doing this show and talking about these things, because as I said, this is a subject and a show so dear to my heart, and it's been such a pleasure being here to talk about these things. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. You know, I am truly an honor to have the person who was present for the legendary Strife episode of Cerebrocast, which is brought to the world such moments of joy and expressions as "I'm you, bitch," which I swear we say with disturbing frequency in my household. You'd be surprised how often that comes up in a conversation, even if you're not taking off your pointy metal helmet for a wig reveal. I
do wonder if this Halloween is finally the year I build that big metal helmet. I do want a pointy helmet. I'm kind of short, so it might be a tough look to pull off so low to the ground, but we'll see.
That is what heels are for.
Yeah, Strife would wear a big platform. I could do that, sure.
Strife totally has the same shoes that the members of KISS wear.
Absolutely, exactly. I can do that. Okay, I feel validated. Thank you. Validated and affirmed. Thank you so much.
We're here to help. So for our listeners to keep up with your work, tell us the best place for them to find you online.
Easiest place to find me is always on Twitter, where I am too much. Twitter.com/Mia Koopa. Bad Latin mass joke for you religion fans out there. MEAKOOPA.
I really think it's one of the great handles of the internet.
Oh, thank you.
And definitely excited to keep listening to your podcasts and interpretations. Sarah,
thank you.
Yeah. And Sarah, I know you're not super on Twitter, but if you want to tell people where they can check out your upcoming, is it the ice skating-y thing that's coming, or?
Well, I am not on Twitter enough for a lot of liking, but I am occasionally there at Padisha, PAS_DECHAT. That is also my Letterboxd name if you're interested in reading my 3-sentence reviews of every movie I watch. But my real home on the internet is my blog, thefinersports.com, the FINER sports. And Alana, where can the listeners find you on the internet?
Definitely not sharing opinions about other countries that should also be banned. You can find me on Twitter all the time, unfortunately, which is ELANA_Brooklyn. As you have heard, I am the host of Graphic Policy Radio. So if you're interested in comics or media that is made about comics, this would be a podcast for you to listen to. Always interviewing comics artists and writers about their work. And
So thank you so much to everybody for listening, and thank you to Anthony Oliveira for joining us. And remember, as Odo says, the same way you read a Bajoran's future is the way that you jerk off a Ferengi.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.